you, Jose, for uh, that amazing introduction. Welcome, family. Thank you for your support and being present. This means a great deal to Exodus and the work that we do. I'm excited, man, to really be in this space. I think today's topic is an important topic, especially when it comes to identifying some of the challenges that the people that we service experience. And I think that this is one of the hidden jewels, if you will, of identifying an angle or a model or an approach that can really make a difference. So welcome to this thing called What's in a Number? And we're going to talk about the DEN number and the systemic origins of carceral trauma. And with that, man, being said, with the welcome, just a couple of things we want to go over. I want to share with you why this training is important and what some of the things we hope to achieve in this training, right? So one, our objective is to consider the ways prisons have become more difficult places in which to adjust and survive over the last several decades. Prison is prison, but there has been some changes, whether it be with the political perspective or approach to incarceration or the physical structure or population of incarceration. There's some changes that kind of make adjustment and rehabilitation somewhat challenging. So we're going to look at a little bit of those challenges as well. We're going to examine how adaptation to modern prison life exacts certain psychological costs for most incarcerated persons, right? So people think that just because we go to prison or a person goes to prison, that they just go along to get along, right? There's a process that people go through in order to adjust and to adapt. And it is in that process that we're going to begin to identify some of the sources of this thing that we call carceral trauma. So the other objective is to identify some groups of people who are more vulnerable to the pains of imprisonment than others. And then we're going to seek to understand how the psychological costs and pains of imprisonment can impede post-prison adjustment, which is key, particularly for those who are in reentry work. So we want to keep all of those things at the forefront. And last but not least, we want to become familiar with some of the things that can be done to kind of assist people both in and outside of prison in order to kind of overcome some of the challenges that result from carceral trauma. With that being said, let me highlight one more thing. If you haven't heard already, we have this beautiful book produced by CTI called From Darkness to Light, a trauma-informed journey to reintegration. Of course, my name is on it, but it's a collective thing. It's a reflection of the team and the work that we have been doing here in the CTI. So although my name is on it, that name is just a symbol of a group of folk who've really been putting in some hard work with trauma work. So I'm blessed to have the name on it, but it's a group ethic. But we're going to talk more about that. Get that link, go get the book, give us some reviews, and we really appreciate the support. With that being said, let's begin to dive in. So entering the system, right? The New York State Department of Correction and Community Supervision reception and orientation process. I think sometimes this is a process that is seldom discussed. This is a process that I think sometimes is overlooked because it is in this process of receiving and processing folk into the prison system where a lot of the carceral trauma begins. So on that note, I want to kind of unpack some of systemically, not just us talking about it, but the actual directives of the Department of Corrections and how they begin to line up this thing that we call orientation and reception. So before we get into the details of that, let's talk a little bit about the prisons, right? So prisons in the United States and elsewhere have always confronted a unique set of contingencies, right, and pressures to which they are required to react and to adapt to survive. And it is in this adaptation to survive that we believe a lot of the carceral trauma is really begin to impact people's lives and to begin to develop to become a part of people's thinking, people's feeling, and people's behavior. So we really want to unpack what that looks like. And one of the ways that the prison systems have changed recently and over the years is that there has been an increase in the number of incarcerated people over the years. Of course, in New York State, the number is going down, but overall, this thing called mass incarceration is real. And the impact of a moment in time where there was a lot of people incarcerated, that created culture that promote and really induce this thing that we call carceral trauma. So one of those things that we're going to look at is the increases in incarceration, and two, the change in the rationale of why we use prisons or what purpose do prisons serve. And that transition from rehabilitation, the idea of helping people transform their lives, to this idea of punishment, making sure people pay for the crime that they committed. And this idea of making sure people pay for the crimes that they committed is kind of the spirit that leads to this thing that we call carceral trauma. So let's unpack it. What you have in front of you now is the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. This reception process involves a couple of things. One, it involves being transported to what's called a reception center, right? And in this reception center, individuals are searched, they're fingerprinted, they're medically screened, they're photographed, they're issued a state-provided ID, they're even given some clothing. We're going to give you a new way to see and receive yourself. They're given a shower and then classified based on their security level before being transferred to a designated correctional facility, right? But there's something else that this process includes that's very important. This process includes the assigning of what's called a department identification number. A department identification number, AKA a DIN number. And it is in this assignment, this assigning of this number to a person that we really want to begin to unpack this thing called carceral trauma. If you take a look at it, I want to look at it one by one to kind of highlight what this process can look like. So the first thing they say is an intake. And in the intake, it's upon arrival at a reception center, and there's several reception centers. I'll identify some of them later on in the presentation throughout the state. But it's in this place that the person is searched, and their identity is verified, they're fingerprinted, right, through this thing called a DigiScan, and they are given this thing called a DIN number. And we're going to talk about that a little bit deeper in a moment. Then they're taken through what's called a medical screening, right? And in this medical screening, the idea is to evaluate them to make sure where they are in terms of their health. And in the process, there's some things that's happening to people as this is happening. And we're going to unpack what that looks like a little bit deeper in a moment. The other thing that they're dealt with is called personal property. So all the things that people come into the system with that's personal, that's taken from them, that's stripped from them. And this is the process of now changing or converting a person into a prisoner. And that's what we're going to look at. The bridge between changing or taking a person and making them into a prisoner is this thing called the DIN number. And we're going to look at this process because in order for a person to become a prisoner, there has to be a change in attitude, there has to be a change in outlook, there has to be a receptivity, right, of this new culture. And it's in this process that serves as the origin of carceral trauma. The closing issue we spoke about, the classification process, and the classification, that's of course based on the crime, the offense, that kind of determines what security level you have and where you're placed. And they're also given a photo identification, and in some instances, they're given a haircut. Now, I'm gonna tell a personal story at this part. When I was first processed, because I'm someone with lived experience, I was received in a place called Elmira Correctional Facility. And in going through this process on paper, it seems like it's just a 1, 2, 3-step process. But when you brief people into this process, it looks different. So imagine a 16-year-old man coming into a correctional facility and going through this process. That intake, medical screening, personal property, clothing, and classification didn't go step by step. There was an engagement with other people, whether they were correctional officers, whether they were nurses, whether they were civilians. And in that interaction, there was some hostility because this begins the introduction to you being less than, for you being a convict or a criminal, for you being those who are an outcast. This type of engagement begins this new orientation into us becoming this new thing called a prisoner. And it is in this tussle, the internal fight, I am not that, you're trying to make me that a lot of the carceral trauma is born, because this fight between systemic imposition and this human freedom not to become or be imposed upon. And it's in this dynamic that carceral trauma is born, if that makes sense. So when I came up, they didn't give me an option to cut my hair. They stripped me, they put me to an area, they didn't give me a shower, they water hosed me, and then at the end of that water hose, they shaved my head. That wasn't a choice. It was a step-by-step process that began this dehumanizing process to let you know you are less than, and at the end of this process, all of this less than, you not being worthy, you being an outcast, is going to be reduced to this thing called a DIN number. And that process was so strong, I still remember my DIN number right now today. It was 89D 2982. And I've been removed from the carceral system for over 20 years, and I still remember that DIN number because the imprint, the traumatic imprint of that process is so profound That's one number that I probably will never forget. I'll forget my phone number before I forget that DIN number because the traumatic impression of that process was so profound. So we're talking about carceral trauma and the systemic origins of carceral trauma. So we have the haircut and we have the assigning of a DIN number. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting some clips from the doc's directives is because I want you to know that this is a process. This is a formulated process that is institutionalized, thus institutionalization. This is an institutionalized process that has a step-by-step method. And the second thing that I want to identify is the Directive 4007, and it's called Incarcerated Individuals Identification Numbers. On paper, it's really simple, but let's take a deep dive into what's in a number, hence the title of this seminar. Here's what they say, the description. This procedure is designed to provide the guidelines for the assignment and use of an incarcerated individual's identification number. Keyword, assignment and use of an incarcerated person's identification number. The Department of Corrections and Community Supervision utilizes two types of identification numbers: the departmental identification number, which is the DIN number, and the New York State identification number, or NASID number. The DIN number shall be included on all reports, documents, and case materials which are being forwarded regarding an incarcerated individual. The whole life of an incarcerated person is now being connected to this thing called a DIN number. Now, on document, it seems like it's reports and it's paper, but undergirding all of this is not just paper that's being assigned this number, it is a person that is being assigned this number. And this relationship between this paper and this person, in my judgment, is the origin of this thing called carceral trauma, especially in the New York State Department of Corrections. So let's look at how they break this thing down. At the top, we see I have a DIN number 01B2345. According to the Department of Corrections, the DIN number is assigned at a reception facility, and it consists of 7 digits made up of 3 components. One, the last 2 digits of the year in which the individual is received. So above 01 will represent 2001. Number 2, the letter designating the facility at which the individual is received. In this case, it's a B, and the reception center that's now being used, and back then too, to assign the letter B was Elmira Correctional Facility. So B is connected to Elmira, Greenhaven, a couple other facilities, but the letter represents the facility that serves as the reception center. And 4 or 3, a 4-digit number indicating the consecutive order in which an individual is received at the reception center. So 2001 is the year, B is the facility, and in that year of 2001 at Elmira, this person would have been the 2,345th person to enter the system. So that's how they begin to create this identity based on the year you came in, the facility that you entered, and the number of the person you were when you came into the center and into the facility. Notice, none of this is connected to your mental health, your emotional health, your family, the community from which you come. As far as they're concerned, this is how they begin to strip you of that connection to reduce you to this thing called a number, and everything on a piece of paper is now who you are. And this is what you're going to be for the remainder of your time in this system. Can you see or hear the origins of this thing called carceral trauma? Now, after they put you through this process, they begin this word. Watch the word here, family. Program orientation. So now they're going to not only strip you, we're going to reorientate you on how you need to begin to look at yourself and this new environment that you're in. So not only are we going to deprive you and deny you who you are, we're going to recreate the person you need to be. And here's the thing, we want you to give us your consent to do so. We want you to willingly give us the authority over you to recreate you in this image and likeness of this thing called the prison system. And this is the tussle, the mental tussle, the emotional tussle, and the behavioral tussle of human beings trying to retain some sense of freedom and dignity in the face of a system that is intended to strip them of their very being. This is what many of us experience when we come home now. After this process, folk come home, and then we wonder why people act out. We wonder why people are socially numb. We wonder why people have maladaptive behaviors, because this experience created this traumatic experience called carceral trauma. Everybody good with that so far? All right. Digging a little deeper. Let's take a little bit now and look at the psychological impact of incarceration. We're going to break it down just a little bit, but understanding the whole idea is to reduce a person to a prisoner by way of this thing called a DIN number. So let's look at the psychological impact of incarceration. I found a quote online that I think speaks to the information that's about to be shared. And the quote says, "Within these prison walls, we are unseen and unheard. Our minds struggle in silence." I can remember coming up, I was taught one way of manhood was, we suffer in silence, right? Men don't talk, you don't hold that, you don't share stuff, right? And some of these ideas we can find being either affirmed or being introduced in this space that we call prison. But I want to take this quote to highlight that we're about to go into the unseen and the heard minds of people who are struggling in silence. And for this reason, a lot of people, after they experience long terms of incarceration, they really value silence. I want to be alone most of the time, right? Because this is some residue of the comfort that being incarcerated have placed us in when it comes to this thing called silence. So let's dive into it. So one area of the psychological effects of incarceration, right? And one thing I want to highlight is penal institutions require inmates or quote unquote incarcerated persons to relinquish freedom and autonomy to make their own choices and decisions. And this process requires what is a painful adjustment for most people. Remember I spoke about earlier them wanting our consent to become this new being? Most of us don't. And the idea is, how can I retain my sense of self? And this is this tussle. I don't want to give you the freedom over my mind. I want to be able to make my choices. I want to be able to make decisions for myself. But the carceral environment is such that those decisions become limited and those choices become limited because the environment is structured in a way where it wants to remove any free will, free thinking that we may have, and then begin to confine us to the rules and regulations of that new orientation that they just spoke about. Because in that orientation, what happens is we get a handbook of rules and regulation, right? So they strip us, and this new orientation says this is the kind of person that you're now going to be connected to this thing called a DIM number. You have to follow rules and regulations. We're going to tell you when we need to see you. We're going to tell you when you can see your family. We're going to tell you when you can go eat. We're going to tell you when you can go to the bathroom, right? So this idea of dictatorship and telling people removes the sense of freedom and choices that we have inside the carceral system. And this is how we become into the path of being what's called institutionalized. Because now we begin to move and think according to the structure and the options presented to folk who are incarcerated. And this is beginning to institutionalize people, begin to think systemically and remove the humanity of people, because now we become this thing called a DIN number that's pre-programmed with this orientation to move according to rules and regulations, and not to human thought, not to human emotions, not to human relationships, but you're going to move according to rules and regulations that we tell you you're supposed to abide by. You don't have a choice in the matter. And this is the kind of environment that begins to create carceral trauma. Two, also inside of incarceration or in prison, many people kind of know that prison can be a dangerous place. And as a result of that, there's this idea of we have to really remain high vigilant, because every moment, any moment, anything could happen in a matter of minutes, right? Whether it's a violent situation, whether it's an attack from a police officer, whether it's disrespect of someone else, this type of hypervigilance that we have to be on our P's and Q's from the moment we walk out of our cells or a cell or a dorm area to the time we return creates this idea of I always have to be on top of things. And guess what? At the end of a long period of incarceration, that doesn't just go away because the gates open. Those are traits that follow most folk who come home because we've been infused in this culture and adapting to this culture for so long. Is that making sense, family? All right. Next thing, emotional over-control, alienation, and psychological distancing, right? A lot of things that we look at require emotional responses. But in environments such as prison, showing emotions could be I'm not going to say dangerous thing, but it could put you in a very compromising situation because emotions in that environment could be taken as a weakness or mistook for weakness, right? So it can create a predatory type of environment for folk, thus again, leading to this hypervigilance, always being on and off cue, but ultimately not showing emotions at all because this environment doesn't warrant it, this environment doesn't respect it, and it can ultimately put me in a situation if I show any type of emotion. And again, these are ideas and these are principles that folk have to take to adjust to the carceral environment. But the thing here is it's becoming attached to this DIN number. This is the seed of carceral trauma. This is the shadow being born of a person in 95% of the cases who will be released back into society. So we start talking about the shadow side of a person. This carceral trauma piece is the shadow being born that many of us carry for those of us who are blessed to experience release, right? So the idea is we want to get an idea of how the system is contributing to this thing that we call carceral trauma, right? But we're not going to stay stuck here. We want to highlight it, but we also want to highlight how we can come up out of it as well. Social withdrawal and isolation, right? And when we think about that, a lot of folk feel the safest moment that I have for some folk is when I close my cell. When I lock that cell, okay, can't nobody get in unless they bust in some kind of way. And what that does over time is it creates a comfort of isolation, right? And I know Jose gonna jump on me for this, for sharing this, but that's one of my shadow points. I am very good at being alone. And Jose has worked extremely hard to get me out of that, the invitation to dinner, invitation to family, and I appreciate that. But social withdrawal is a real thing. But this is an extension, the residue of this thing that we call carceral trauma and the effects of incarceration. Incorporation of exploitative norms, what that simply means is in our adaptation, there's certain things, there's a way you have to move when you're in prison that oftentimes doesn't translate well to the norms of society when we get out, right? So a lot of the maladaptive, well, Murtha's going to jump on me, but a lot of the adaptive behaviors that we use to adjust to prison became maladaptive. And now this maladaptive thing while in prison becomes adaptive. It becomes normal. And we normalize this type of behavior to the point where if you're doing it for 20 years and 30 years and 40 years, when we come home, it's going to be hard to drop that because this is what we've been accustomed to doing for so many years. So adapting to the prison culture, be it violence or how we maneuver, this is also a trait that comes along with carceral trauma. A diminished sense of self-worth and personal value I discussed. And last but not least, post-traumatic stress reactions to the pains of imprisonment. And this is what we experience a lot with our folk. We call it acting out or people wilding out. Sometimes that's the expression, but behind all of that is this a trauma response from so many years and such a bruised experience during incarceration. So I hope all this is making sense. And this is just one way that we want to take a look at carceral trauma. So with that being said, what does this do or what does this say as people are considering coming home? What comes with us? What do we carry with us out of the system? What do we carry with us from this experience and how can it impact us? And what we're learning is, of course, the psychological consequences of incarceration represent significant impediments to post-prison adjustment. Adjustment is difficult when we're functioning from a trauma response. And the danger is that many of us don't know. We're not aware of the ways we've been impacted by incarceration. And one of the things I love about Exodus is that there's some folk, when you come home after doing a stretch, one of the things we ask you or ask people is because people are excited and they want to get right to the business. But we ask people to pause and we ask the question, what just happened to you, man? We know you're excited. We know you want to work. We know you want to get your life going. That's going to happen. But take a moment to think about what just happened to you. What did you just go through? What are some of the things that impacted your life? How are they impacting you now? And those conversations we think are critical because many of us, when we come out, we get right to the business and there's no moment of pause to have conversations or reflect on the experience that we just had and how that may have impacted our lives. So for us, this is important. And just some ideas, some quick ideas on what the implications of carceral trauma is for folk who are coming out. The psychological consequence of incarceration may represent a significant impediments to post-prison adjustment, and that we get, right? And as I just said, for us, most of that comes in with the institutionalization, right? The emotional numbness, and all of those things play out, whether it's with our families, whether it's on the job, whether it's within our own head. A lot of that stuff still impacts us post-incarceration, and we want to highlight that point. With that being said, I want to talk a little bit about, and this is my brother Jorge, he's going to be a doctor soon, and he highlights this thing called PICS. But I want to talk about it a little bit because we think it's important that we talk about and we empower folk with some ways to identify some of the traits of someone who has been dealing with carceral trauma. So let's talk about post-prison adjustment and what is post-carceral syndrome, right? So the post-carceral syndrome, PCS, is a psychiatric disorder that affects individuals who have been incarcerated, then are released back into society. It is characterized by a range of psychological, emotional, and social difficulties that can arise as a result of being in prison. And these difficulties can include depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, difficulty adjusting to life outside of prison, and difficulty forming and maintaining relationships. What is it? PCS is not currently a recognized psychiatric disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders or the International Classification of Diseases. So it's not yet a posted recognized diagnosis per se, but that does not mean people have not been psychologically impacted by incarceration in ways that we need to identify and work with. Two, the term is used by some researchers and practitioners to describe the very real psychological challenges that people who have been in prison may face upon reentry. And it's called different things. So PCS is one thing, but what's the difference? Some people call it post-carceral syndrome. Some people call it post-incarceration syndrome, PICS. Some people call it post-traumatic prison disorder, right? But these terms are all referring to the same phenomena of a person's struggle to re-enter society after being incarcerated. What you call it, right? But the important thing here is recognizing that some folk have been through some things, and there's a process and some things that we can identify to help them unpack and to heal from some of that traumatic experience, if that makes sense. With that being said, is carceral trauma, PCS, in the same as PTSD? While PCS may include symptoms of PTSD, it is important to note that PCS is not the same as PTSD, and PCS is a proposed disorder that is used by some researchers and practitioners to describe, again, the psychological challenges that individuals who have been incarcerated face upon reentry. So we want to make that distinction. As we're wrapping it up, what are some of the causes of the carceral syndrome? Some of this you already know, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I want to highlight some key points. The exact causes of it are not fully understood, but it's believed that a variety of factors may contribute to the development of the condition, of this condition. And these factors include trauma, as we just spoke about, loss of social support when people go away from family and community, loss of skills and knowledge or the lack thereof, or not being able to access and develop new knowledge and skills to improve themselves, the stigma, of course, that goes along with that. And a lot of these things we believe creates an environment, but also creates the context for what we call incarceral trauma. And of course, lack of resources, as I just mentioned. What are some of the signs? Depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, as we mentioned, difficulty adjusting to life, social isolation. And these things are important because many folk, well, I can't say many folk, I'm speaking for myself. I know that when I was transitioning, you couldn't tell me that I wasn't ready. I had a college degree, education, I was facilitating inside, I was inspiring people, I was doing a lot of great work. So in my mind, you couldn't tell me that I was ready. But life has a way of introducing itself to you in ways that we can't prepare for. And what we're trying to empower folk who are connected and helping folk who are just impacted to see is just get people to kind of see, right? How, yeah, you got all the tools, you got all the external workings of someone who can be successful, but there's an internal journey that has to accompany the external journey. And much of the work that we do is helping folk correct, or move forward on that internal journey so it matches and meets up with the external accomplishments and capacity, if that makes sense. Everybody good with that? All right. So, on the wrap up, what are ways to mitigate the effects of PCS or PICS, whatever you choose? There are several strategies that can be used to mitigate the effects of post-incarceration syndrome PICS. These strategies may include providing access to mental health treatment. Even though we are peer supporters, we are credible messengers, we are not therapists. So we always want to make sure that people get the professional help that they need and encourage folks to take advantage of the resources because therapy is good. Providing support and resources during the transition back into society, providing education, of course, and job training, providing peer support and mentorship, and reducing the stigma surrounding incarceration. With that being said, what are some ways you can help somebody with PCS? Because I'm the first to admit I need help. Just using myself as an example, right? So, if you're working with someone who has been affected by PCS, it is important to provide them with support and understanding. Here are some things you can do to support someone with PICS. One, listen and offer emotional support. Sometimes folks need to be heard. Sometimes folks need to think out loud. So sometimes they can see, man, that don't sound right. So just the idea of listening and offering some emotional support to folk is a solid thing. Two, encouraging them to seek help, which I emphasize because a lot of us think we're okay. And for the most part, we may be, but that shadow is always with us. And we definitely need some help unpacking the contents of our darker side sometimes. Three, help them to connect with resources, of course. And last but not least, be understanding and patient. I cannot undervalue patient because there's some folk who you would tell the same thing. I know I was one of them over and over and over again. And if you don't have the patience, it definitely can be frustrating, but sometimes it takes time. Some folk took 20 years, 30 years to develop the habits and personality of incarceration. It's not going to disappear in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, right? Because folk have spent more time being this dysfunctional self as opposed to being their functional self. So it's going to take some patience and understanding, especially those who are in the field of serving and working with folk who are just as impacted, right? So if anything else, if you're on the policy side, just some thoughts to keep with you. If you're in a position where you can do some rallying and some support or lend your voice for leverage, prison conditions and policies are definitely where we are highlight interest. No significant amount of progress can be made in easing transition from prison to home until and unless significant changes are made in the normative structure of American prisons. Two, transitional services to prepare our people for community release. No significant amount of progress can be made in easing the transition from prison to home until and unless significant changes are made in the way prisoners are prepared to leave prison and re-enter into the free world. Last but not least, community-based services and facilitate and maintain, right, reintegration. No significant amount of progress can be made in easing transition from prison to home until and unless significant changes are made in the way individuals who are justice impacted are treated and how they're received in the free world in their community. So this is very important, and we ask in any way that you can, you always lend your voice, but more importantly, your one-to-one support and encouragement of a person who's justice impacted is critical.